Hello, everybody. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the differences between English law and Spanish law during the colonial period. All right, this English are going to have something called common law, excuse me, common law, and the Spanish are going to practice something called civil law. And those two law codes are a little different, and we're going to talk about how that difference is manifest in the lives of your typical colonists. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about another series, an economic system called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is this idea that colonies exist to provide raw materials and markets for the home countries. All right. In other words, what would happen is that in the colonies, you would collect, say, for example, beaver pelts. Beaver pelts were a valuable commodity that you could actually go into a typical store, dry goods store, and you could trade guns and food and anything like this for beaver pelts, because beaver pelts had value and it's called commodity trading. And so you could then take that, and the merchants would take those beaver pelts, sell them back in England. And in England, they would take those beaver pelts, they would steam them, squash them down, and turn them into felt, high quality, high dollar felt hats, little top hats, things like this. Bowler hats were actually made from beaver pelt, which made them extremely rare and desirable for wealthy people and as a way of showing wealth. All right, and the ones you don't sell in England, you ship back to the colonists where the beaver pelt came from in the first place, and you sell to those colonists. So in that sense, the colonies provide both the raw materials and the market. But what's missing in all of this is they are not supposed to be the manufacturers. And in fact, England is going to pass a whole series of laws, so is Spain, making industrialization basically illegal in North America. Now, I should tell you that the people in British North America promptly ignored that law for the most part. For example, there is a minor league baseball team in Hartford, Connecticut called the Hatters. All right, because they didn't like sending their beaver pelts over to England to be turned into hats, but it was illegal. So you know what they did? They did it anyway, and then undercut the price on the British hats in the process, which is partly why they were so expensive. All right. If you ever heard of the Mad Hatter, the Hatter, for example, in Alice in Wonderland, who's wearing his 6 shillings and 10 pence hat, he is a Mad Hatter because he's been in part of the process is they treat it with mercury, and so he probably has mercury poisoning, and so he's gone a little loopy because of the mercury poisoning and the neurological damage from that. So anyway, so all of these things are beginning to happen. And so colonies as raw supplies and markets meant that they never really got ahead financially. Individuals did, but I'm talking about the colonies in general. They're not going to be rolling in wealth anytime soon, because any money that they make selling raw materials is going to just be spent on manufactured goods. And so there's really it's very hard to accumulate wealth. And in the South, we're seeing this. They're taking the tobacco and they're rolling it and tying it and shipping it over to England, who's then chopping it up into snuff or into dip, plus making silver and tream snuff boxes and shipping them back over. But you really weren't supposed to make your own snuff in Virginia, although some people did. All right, and so this is also kind of because it kind of shows that some of the colonists didn't really like, even in the early 1700s, some of the colonists really didn't like the British mercantile system or the Spanish mercantile system. Spanish are doing the exact same thing, but with silver and some of these other raw materials, foodstuffs, things like that. All right, so one of the things is they basically begin to sort of leave England out. They ignore them. And kind of almost an act of economic rebellion, they developed their own trade routes, their own what's called triangle trade. And what that would happen is merchants would go to Africa and they would purchase slaves. They would bring the slaves down to the Caribbean. The Caribbean then would use those slaves to raise sugarcane. The sugarcane then would be And sugar cane wasn't sold as like sugar. You couldn't do like a bag of sugar or something like this. Instead, sugar cane was turned into molasses. And molasses, of course, has the different layers. The light molasses at the top, which is really sweet and yummy. And people like to use it to sweeten their oats, their breakfast, or whatever it is, their cakes, make cookies out of it, molasses cookies and what have you. The middle is a little stronger. It's almost a little too sweet to eat for some people, and so we'll figure out what they're going to do with that here in a second. And then the bottom part is called backstrap molasses, which has a lot of good nutrition in it and some nutrients and stuff like this, but it tastes awful and terrible. And so what you do is you mix it with oats, and you make what's called sweet feed or sweet oats for your horses and cows. If you know anyone who raises horses, they may talk about sweet feed or sweet oats, and that's oats that have been mixed with backstrap molasses. All right, so you've got these slaves, and they've been working hard in the sugar cane, and it was very hard labor, and the life expectancy was very low. And so there was always a constant need for new slaves to replace those that had died in the field or died of diseases. And so, but what happens to the sugar cane? In the mercantile system, the sugar should have been sent to England. Instead, it's being sent up here to New England, to Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is turning that middle layer. They're bottling the top layer of sweet molasses for cookies and stuff. And that middle layer, they're turning into rum. As in, think back to, Pirates of the Caribbean, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. That's the stuff right there. And so it's being turned into rum in distilleries, and then they're taking that rum and they're putting it on boats, and they're not sending it to England like they should. Instead, they're sending it to Africa, and it's one of the many trade goods that are being used to trade for people that are going to be enslaved in the Caribbean. And so you see, Europe is being left out of this system, this triangle trade. Because people were tired of England and Spain and France profiting while the colonists floundered. They didn't necessarily get ahead, they didn't necessarily fall behind, but they just sort of maintained the status quo. All right, so if that's the same, what's the difference between Spain and English is their law codes. The British believe in something called common law, British common law. If you've ever heard the phrase common law wife or common law husband, that's where this comes from. Okay, in common law, your rights are based on your property. You are allowed to vote, for example, if you can demonstrate that you have a stake in the community. You are allowed to vote if you can show that you own property in a particular district or that you have a certain amount of wealth. And this is the origin of voting districts. For example, I voted for school board and hospital board and county commissioners and everything. And the elections I'm allowed to vote in, are based exclusively on my address. Nothing else. It doesn't matter if I'm a teacher, I have purple hair, I wear glasses. Nothing else matters. All that matters is I own property at a certain address, and that address happens to be in a certain district. All right, so that's British common law, is that your rights are based on your property. And there's also an expectation of it's actually just called the commons, where there's areas that are held in common trust and shared by many people. That it's property that lots of people can use to graze their sheep, their cattle, that sort of thing. And they're all supposed to be nice to each other and not overgraze and what have you. It doesn't always work. It's called tragedy of the commons. All right, so that's common law. It's a little more complicated than that, but really, it really is, where are you? Where's your property? And if you don't have enough property, it's at least where are you living, and do you have enough cash, wealth on you that you could own property if you wanted to. So it's not like if you're a renter, you never get to vote. You just have to make sure that when you go to vote, you have to be able to prove, look, I've got a certain amount of money in my pocket, therefore I have a stake in the community. And the logic behind that is not necessarily that they are opposed to poor people, or they only want to make sure certain people vote, although that is part of it. But all part of it is they want to make sure that the people who vote for a representative are the ones that representative will be representing. In other words, going back to my school board example, I do not get to vote in the O'Donnell School Board elections because I don't live in O'Donnell. My children don't go to O'Donnell. There's no reason other than, I mean, there's no logical reason why I should be able to vote in the O'Donnell school election. I don't have a stake in that election, as opposed to in La Mesa, which is where my property is and where my daughter is. The Spanish, their rights are based on civil law. And in civil law, your rights are based on your membership in particular groups. So, for example, if I was a soldier, then I could take advantage of what's called the fuero militar. It's the rights of soldiers. If I committed a crime, then I didn't go before a normal jury. I went before a jury of other soldiers who would decide my guilt or innocence based on the evidence as they weighed it. By the way, in England, your juries have to come from a certain, again, geographical area. You're not going to be, you're going to be summoned, you're going to sit on a jury because you live in that area, not because of anything else. You just happen to live there. Anyways, whereas Spain, you're being judged by other soldiers. Or if you're a priest accused of a crime, you're going to be judged by other priests. And sometimes these laws would extend in kind of strange ways. For example, if I got into a fight and say I accidentally killed a soldier, I could potentially be tried in soldier court. And as you can probably imagine, I'm not going to necessarily get a real fair trial in front of a bunch of soldiers. Or if I got into a fight and accidentally killed a priest, then I may go to a religious priestly court. And each of these courts have certain authority that what they are allowed to or not allowed to do. The problem is, and then other groups you could be a member of, is you could be a member of your city. You could be, your civil law could extend to, I am a citizen, city, and civil all come from the same Latin word. And so I'm a citizen of this particular city. It's not whether or not I live there, it's the fact that I'm a citizen of that law, that place that determines my rights. And so if I'm a soldier in Las Cruces and I get into a fight with a priest and I accidentally kill him, then someone has to decide, do I go to city court? Do I go to soldier court? Do I go to priest court? And therein lies the challenge, okay? Because other groups have their courts and their rights. For example, your guild membership, if you're a member of a guild or a union, you have certain rights that are exclusively for you. For example, the Silversmiths Guild is the only guild in Spanish America that is allowed to make coins. If anyone else is found making coins, even if they're legal size and pure, the right purity and things like this, they have violated the law. They're considered fake coins. They're going to be melted down, handed over to the silversmiths who are going to make the exact same coins, but they're legal and the other ones weren't somehow. If all this sounds confusing, it's because it is. All right. In fact, it gets so confusing that after a while, going back to I'm a soldier in Las Cruces who accidentally kills a priest. There's three courts all trying to hang me, and so I've got to decide which one I can or can't be. And because all these rights are butting up against each other, what happens is the people who are in power, the governors, the viceroy, and of course ultimately the king, have to make a lot of decisions whenever these are rights that are butting up against each other or contradicting each other. So, for example, the governor in Las Cruces would look at my case and decide which court I would be tried in. So this always kind of keeps you a little bit guessing, but more importantly is it keeps people in charge, because you can't function if everybody's trying to say, well, my right is this, well, my right is this, and they're constantly arguing with each other. So someone's got to be in command. And so it assures that the King of Spain's position is secure. Whereas common law, because my property is my rights, then I don't need a king. I can be satisfied with local government and maybe or state government, colonial government. The king is a long ways away. We can function just fine without him. And in fact, by the time of the Revolution, many colonists, even the loyalists, typically thought of themselves as Americans, not as British. Now, they thought of themselves as Americans who were British subjects. The loyalists did. The founding fathers, the rebellion, thought of themselves as Americans who are trying to form something different, break away from England, but they still kind of thought of themselves as Americans because there wasn't the constant conflict of rights to keep the king and the governor in your daily life and keep your focus on who is really in charge. It makes it easier to set up representative democracy, republicanism, if you have this definite everybody, regardless if you're soldier, priest, silversmith, whatever, you own property in a certain region. Therefore, you get to vote for the representative of that region, and then each region then sends one representative to the House of Burgesses or the whatever the colonial Congress or whatever. In England, in Spain, you imagine you're having an election, and the silversmiths, because the silversmiths are about 1 out of every 1,000 people in Mexico has ties to silversmith. So that means that 1 out of every 1,000 legislators is elected exclusively by the silversmiths. And so I may be voting for someone that lives on the other side of Mexico because I'm a silversmith, they're a silversmith, and so we have this election going on. And so what ends up happening is it becomes much more harder to establish representative democracy, and we're going to see that after everybody has revolutions, in that Spanish America is much less successful in establishing a stable government than the British America. British America is going to be very successful, and minus the Civil War, of course, in establishing a government. Canada is going to be even more successful at establishing a stable government because it was easier under British common law than under Spanish civil law. All right, so just to kind of summarize, British common law based on property, Spanish civil law based on guild or protected group membership, right? But all of them are economically, they're dominated by the economic system of mercantilism. Okay, and that's all I have for now, and I will talk to you later.